You're not just tired. You're drained in places even sleep can't touch. Because somewhere along the way, you started carrying what was never yours to hold. And you've been praying. You've been crying. But the weight hasn't lifted. That's not because God is ignoring you. It's because you've been talking to Him, but still holding on. This video is your moment to finally let go. So don't scroll. Don't look away. Because what follows isn't just words. It's Jesus speaking directly to your burdened soul. My precious child, I see how heavy it's been. The expectations, the silent pressure, the pain you're pretending doesn't exist. The moments you lay in bed, paralyzed by thoughts, knowing tomorrow asks more of you than today already stole. The invisible load you carry while putting on a brave face. You've convinced yourself that strength means holding everything together. That if you let go, everything and everyone will fall apart. But that's not strength. That's survival. And survival was never your calling. I didn't create you to survive. I created you to live fully, freely, and with me. With a soul that breathes, a heart that feels light, and a mind that knows peace. Let me take you back to a moment you've probably forgotten. That night you sat in the dark with your hands clenched and your heart racing. You whispered, "I can't do this anymore." But no one heard it. No one except me. And in that very moment, I was whispering too, "Then give it to me." You were never meant to carry it alone. I have watched you crumble under the weight of expectations that were never yours to meet. The pressure to be everything for everyone, all while slowly becoming nothing to yourself. But child, that is not your identity. That is not your purpose. Let me tell you about someone named Kara. She was a caregiver, strong, reliable, always the one others leaned on. But the truth, she was breaking. The weight of her sick mother, her job, her kids, it was all too much. But she didn't want to seem weak. So she smiled. She served. She suffocated. Until one morning, in the quiet before dawn, she opened her Bible randomly, and her eyes landed on one verse. Cast all your anxiety on Him because He cares for you. That's from 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 7. She read it. Then she read it again. And for the first time, she didn't just pray. She handed it over. She said, "Jesus, if you're real, I need you to carry this. Because I can't." And I did. Not by snapping my fingers, but by walking with her, one weight at a time. That's what I want to do for you. Not just listen to your pain, but lift it. Because child, I never asked you to be everything. I asked you to trust me with everything. You're carrying things I never asked you to pick up. Guilt that I already forgave. Worries about tomorrow I already walked ahead into. Expectations that were never yours to meet. Old regrets that I already buried. Shame I never wrote into your story. When you feel like the world is too much, remember what I said in Matthew chapter 11, verse 28. "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." That wasn't a suggestion. That was a promise. A divine invitation to stop holding and start healing. Let me carry your worry. Let me carry the fear you hide behind your laughter. Let me carry the outcome you've been obsessing over. Let me carry what's been keeping you awake at night. Let go, not because you're failing, but because that's what faith is. Releasing what you can't fix into the hands of the one who can. So many of my children are exhausted, not because they don't believe, but because they refuse to surrender. They pray, and then take back the burden. They trust, until control feels safer than closeness. They serve me with their mouths, but keep the pain hidden behind their backs. Don't let that be your story. You weren't created to carry it all. You were created to walk with me. And let me carry what you can't. And when you do, you'll find what Kara found. Not ease, but endurance. Not quick fixes, but quiet strength. Not escape, but Emmanuel, God with you. Not perfection, but peace. Do you know what happens when you finally let go? Not everything gets easier, but everything gets lighter. Because when your soul releases what your hands can't carry, heaven rushes in. Surrender is not about giving up. It's about giving over. It's about trusting the hands that molded mountains to also hold your Mondays. Let me show you what that looks like. There was a man named Elijah, a prophet, strong in faith, bold in voice. But even Elijah had a moment where he said, "I've had enough, Lord." He lay under a tree and begged me to take his life. And what did I do? I didn't rebuke him. I fed him. I let him sleep. And then I whispered, because even the strongest break sometimes. And when they do, I don't walk away. I get closer. That's what I'm doing now with you. You've been telling yourself that letting go means giving up. But no, child. Letting go means inviting me in. So let me in. Into your decisions. Into your deadlines. Into that tight space between faith and fear. Into your inbox, your calendar, your living room, your hidden heart. Do you remember when I fed the 5,000? My disciples came to me, overwhelmed, and said, "We only have 5 loaves and 2 fish." They thought it wasn't enough, but I didn't ask them to multiply it. I just asked them to give it. And when they did, I handled the rest. I'm asking the same of you. Give me what you have, even if it feels small, even if it feels broken, even if it's just a tired whisper saying, "Help," even if all you have is your tears and silence. Because what you place in my hands, I bless. And what I bless, no burden can break. Let me tell you about Marcus. He was in ministry, doing everything right, but quietly, he was struggling with anxiety and burnout. Every night he cried out, "God, where are you? Why does this still feel heavy?" And one night, I spoke clearly, "You keep giving me words, but not the weight." So he wrote it down. Literally, he listed every burden and placed it on his nightstand with a prayer. "Jesus, I'm done carrying this. Please take it." And something changed, not all at once, but slowly, steadily. Peace began to outrun panic. Joy began to return to places long numb. Because that's what happens when you release control and give me room to move. When you stop performing and start trusting. When your heart becomes a place I'm welcome, not just mentioned. So now I ask you, what are you still holding? What outcome are you still trying to manipulate? What pain are you still pretending doesn't hurt? What dream are you afraid to trust me with? Lay it down, not just in theory, but in faith, not with perfection, but with permission for me to step in. I am not overwhelmed by what overwhelms you, and I do my best work in surrendered hands. So let this be your moment, to let go, to breathe, to trust that when you release it, I will catch it. Because, child, you were never meant to carry it alone. You were meant to walk with me. And when you do, you'll finally find rest. Not the kind the world gives, but the kind only heaven can. Because I'm not just offering you help. I'm offering you myself. Before this video ends, I want to pray over you. The one who stayed. The one who listened. The one who, even in their silence, has been crying for relief. My beloved child, I see the battle you fight inside. I feel the weight you try to hide. But I want you to know, you're not alone. Right now, I speak peace over your mind, clarity over your confusion, rest over your anxiety. I pray that you'll have the courage to lay every burden down, not just the loud ones, but the quiet ones too, the thoughts that scream in the night, the regrets that whisper shame, the expectations that steal your joy. Let this be the moment you finally breathe again. Let this be the night your heart remembers what it's like to feel light again. I'm not distant. I'm not angry. I am here, and I have always loved you. Not the perfect version of you, but the real one. So come as you are, and give me what's breaking you. I promise, I can carry it. You made it this far for a reason. This wasn't just a video. This was your reminder. Heaven sees you, and I'm still calling your name. With all of heaven's love, I am Jesus, and I'm not letting go of you.